What is tragedy? In the fourth video in this series, we shall be looking at Aeschylus' play Agamemnon, which is one of the earliest of the Greek tragedies. We will be looking in particular at two of the episodes and then finishing by considering the problem of justice. Greek tragedies were usually performed in Athens at the festival in honour of the god Dionysus. And for this event, although there were some plays that were performed individually, playwrights often devised a trilogy of tragedies, which were then followed by a satyr play. Satyrs were mythic creatures that were half human, half goat, and from the one satyr play which survives, these seem to have been quite rough comic performances. The Agamemnon, which is the play we're looking at in this video, is the first in the Oresteia by Aeschylus, and this happens to be the only surviving complete Greek tragedy trilogy. It consists of the plays Agamemnon, Libation Bearers, sometimes referred to by its Greek title Koephoroi, and finally the Eumenides. And as the title of the trilogy suggests, the common thread here is the story of Orestes, who was the son of Agamemnon. Before we begin thinking about this play, we need to know the legendary backstory. According to mythology, Helen, the wife of Menelaus, was abducted by Paris, son of Priam, king of Troy. Well, perhaps abducted, or perhaps they eloped together. In order to bring her back, Menelaus' brother Agamemnon, the king of Argos, has assembled a fleet to convey a Greek army to Troy. But the fleet is becalmed by adverse winds at Aeschylus. Now, the prophet Calchas has told Agamemnon that he has somehow offended the goddess Artemis. Different versions of the myth explain the offence in different ways. Anyway, the winds will only change direction if Agamemnon sacrifices to our Artemis, and the sacrificial victim is to be his own daughter, Iphigenia. And this is what he does. Now, our play begins 10 years later. Clytemnestra has set up a chain of beacons which are spread across the sea between Argos and Troy. They will convey a message that Troy has fallen. And this is what happens at the opening of the play, when the watchman sees the light that is flashing from Troy through the series of beacons. Later in the play, Agamemnon returns home and is murdered by Clytemnestra. During Agamemnon's 10-year absence besieging Troy, Clytemnestra has taken a lover, Aeschylus. Now here we have a further complication in the story, because Aeschylus is the son of Thyestes, who had been killed by his own brother Atreus. Atreus was the father of Agamemnon. Both Clytemnestra, grieving for her daughter, and Aeschylus, wishing for revenge on behalf of his father, both of these characters have motives for the killing of Agamemnon. The play ends with Clytemnestra and Aeschylus apparently triumphant, though of course more is to come. This is a rich and complex play, and we only have time in this video to look at two of the key moments. The first is when the chorus tells us what happened at Aulis all those years ago. Agamemnon is clearly presented with a terrible, tragic dilemma, in which it seems that there is no easy or indeed even good course of action. He seems to have a choice between two appalling consequences. If he goes ahead and sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia, Artemis will be placated, the winds will change, the fleet will sail to Troy, and they have a chance of recovering Helen. Moreover, when Paris and Helen ran off from Menelaus and went off to Troy, that was a breach of hospitality because Paris had been Menelaus's guest. Hospitality was taken extremely seriously by the Greeks, and there was a bond established between host and guest, which would endure even in subsequent generations. And the sacredness of hospitality was protected by Zeus himself. So in a way, the pursuit of Helen is a defense of hospitality and a way of obeying Zeus. But of course, this would be at the expense of the slaughter of Agamemnon's own child. So what happens if he decides not to sacrifice her? He will lose face in the eyes of the army. It will dishonor him. And given his status as king, losing face is a very important consideration. They will have no chance of recovering Helen, and not only Agamemnon's honor but Menelaus's honor will be stained by this failure. Let's look at what the chorus imagines Agamemnon to have said as he contemplates this terrible dilemma. This is just a short extract. "It is a grievous doom not to comply, and a grievous one if I am to slay my child, the delight of my house, polluting a father's hands with streams of a slaughtered maiden's blood close by the altar. Which of these options is free from evil?" Now we see from the last question there that Agamemnon recognizes that there is no good option here. The word which Summerstein translates as grievous here, baleia, really means heavy. So Agamemnon is conscious that this is a burden that weighs heavily upon him. And you can see from the way in which that word is repeated at the beginning of those two lines over on the left there, how emphatic that is. Then there's another interesting word which is translated here as doom. The Greek is ker. Ker means doom or destruction, but Ker was also regarded in Greek thinking as a goddess. So there may be an implication here of some kind of supernatural presence or intervention. And the third word that I'd like to draw to your attention is miainon, polluting. This verb, in a sense, has two meanings. Literally, it means staining, so Agamemnon's hands will be literally stained with the blood of his own daughter. But also, metaphorically, it means polluting. And a crime of murder in Greek thinking polluted the person responsible, and that pollution could be transferred to other people around the person who was responsible. and could only be removed by some kind of ritual, perhaps by making an offering at the shrine of a god. So this is a very loaded word, miainon, polluting, staining, both literally and metaphorically. And we can see even from this fragment how grievous, how heavy is the decision that Agamemnon has to make. Let us look now at the passage when the chorus is telling us what happened as Agamemnon made his decision. This is what they say. And when he put on the yoke strap of necessity, his mental wind veering in a direction that was impious, impure, unholy. From that point he turned to a mindset that would stop at nothing. For men are emboldened by miserable infatuation, whose shameful schemes are the beginning of their sufferings. The beginning of this extract points to the complex question of agency, which we touched on in an earlier video. And the chorus seems to think that two kinds of explanation are needed for this extraordinary act. First of all, it is entirely voluntary. He put on, and the Greek is clear about that, eidio, the yoke strap of necessity. The yoke strap refers to the kind of harness that you would put on an animal, for example, if you were going ploughing. So this is what Agamemnon actually puts on his own shoulders. The yoke strap, lepadnon. But it's the yoke strap of necessity, anankas, and that implies that some force outside of Agamemnon is compelling him to do this. So this seems to be quite a complex map of agency. It's an act that he does, but it's also something which is compelled. And the chorus is quite clear that this is an impious and impure act. The negative prefixes there in the English translation are an accurate way of rendering the Greek, because the Greek words anagnon and anieron both start with that prefix a, which is a sign of negation. And they say that Agamemnon here has been emboldened by miserable infatuation, parakopa, which could also be translated madness or frenzy, implying then that this is no rational decision. And they're clear that human beings who give way to that kind of frenzy are beginning their own sufferings, as indeed we shall see. Let us move now to the episode at the end of the play, when Agamemnon returns home to Argos and is greeted by Clytemnestra. In front of him, she spreads out some rich and elaborate tapestries, which stretch from his chariot up to the door leading into the palace. She invites him to walk into the palace on those fabrics. Why does she want him to do that? She is in effect tempting him to a form of hubris. And as we noticed in an earlier video, hubris is that form of pride which is offensive to the gods. And Agamemnon, quite rightly, begins by refusing to do this. For a start, these rich fabrics constitute part of the wealth of the household, and if he walks on them with his feet dirty from travelling, he would spoil them. But more importantly, as he himself recognises, this is the kind of honour which is reserved for the gods, and for a human being to walk on tapestries cannot be without fear, he says. He's well aware that hubris is liable to bring down nemesis, divine retribution. And one of the questions that Clytemnestra asks him when she's trying to persuade him to do this is, what do you think Priam would have done if he had been victorious? And Agamemnon says, well, I'm sure he would have walked on tapestries. Well then, why don't you? But of course, in the eyes of the Greeks, Priam was not only an enemy, but as a king in Asia, he was regarded as a barbarian. Walking on tapestries is what barbarian kings do. It's not what Greeks do. Agamemnon says, honour me like a man, not a god, quite rightly, but he eventually gives in to Clytemnestra's persuasion. And of course, these tapestries spread out to form a path up to the entrance to the house are blood red. They have been stained by shellfish culled from the seas. That's what gives them their dark red purple colour. And so visually, what unfolds before us and what unfolds before Agamemnon here is a kind of path of blood leading up to the house. And the omen will very soon turn into reality. Alongside Agamemnon in his chariot, when he returns to his home, is Cassandra, the Trojan princess, whom he has captured and has brought back as a slave. Now, Cassandra is not only a princess, she is a prophetess, but her gift of prophecy is compromised. She speaks the truth, but she has been cursed that no one will believe her. And the speeches that she makes when Agamemnon has gone into the house are very disturbing to the chorus as they listen to her. For a start, Aeschylus has included in her speech some very strange words, and scholars have in some cases been quite unable to find these words anywhere else in Greek literature. So we can be sure that the original audience would have felt that this was a very strange, remote way of speaking. Her actual vocabulary then marks her speech out as something extraordinary. What is also extraordinary is what she sees, because as she looks at the house, which forms the backdrop to the stage area, she sees not only what is going on in that house in the present moment, she also sees the past, which includes the murder of Thyestes and his children by Atreus, and she sees the present and the future. She sees the immediate future, which is the murder of Agamemnon and her own death. So it's the case here that the past is very much brought into the present in Cassandra's vision, and also, of course, the past is brought into the present as Clytemnestra's reason for killing her husband. It's also Aegisthus's reason for assisting in the killing. After the murder of Agamemnon and Cassandra, the bodies are brought out of the house and placed there on the threshold. It's an action which will be repeated in the next play in the trilogy, The Libation Bearers, when the bodies of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus are brought out of the house and placed just where the bodies of Agamemnon and Cassandra had been. A very visual demonstration of a particular form of justice or retribution. So finally, let's think about this question of justice. It's a problem that besets the entire trilogy. And the Greek word for justice, dike, echoes right through the sequence. Different characters claim that what they are doing is justice. But that, of course, is a contentious claim. There are different forms of justice at work in the play. The chorus says at one point that what it has seen is a form of vengeance, an eye for an eye, as it were. Insult comes in return for insult, and it is a hard struggle to judge. The ravager is ravaged, the killer pays. It remains firm while Zeus remains on his throne, that he who does shall suffer, for that is his ordinance. Who can cast the seed of the curse out of the house? So we have here some very clear examples of retributive justice, when someone is meant to pay virtually in kind for what they have done. Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon in revenge for his killing of Iphigenia. No doubt she is also riled by the arrival of Cassandra as his slave. Aegisthus takes part in the killing of Agamemnon as a form of vengeance for his father Thyestes, killed by Agamemnon's father Atreus. We can see here how important it is that the past is never quite over and done with. And then in the next play, The Libation Bearers, Orestes will kill Clytemnestra and Aegisthus in revenge for their killing of his father. There is then a cycle of retribution, even though it may be called justice, which goes from generation to generation. We have 3 generations here of killing. And it seems likely that this cannot be stopped. There is no reason why the cycle of vengeance and retribution should ever finish. And that is the problem with which Aeschylus wrestles in the second and third plays of the trilogy. The Libation Bearers, which stages the return of Orestes to bring justice for his murdered father, and then the Eumenides, when Athens as a whole tries to work out a different form of justice, which will bring an end to the society of the vendetta and establish civilization on a more secure footing.